The purpose of this lecture is to set the context for part 3 of Americas in the Heart by Carlos Blusan. This lecture will have 2 parts. The first and longer part will be to review the main ideas in the reading related to Alos's development from parts 1 and 2. And the second is to set the historical context for part 3. So let's start with our review. The reader at this point should be carefully following Alos's character development as he experiences a social awakening. In part 1, the social awakening is specifically related to Alos's understanding about social classes. And while there are many anecdotes that he relates to talk about how he becomes aware of the distinction between social classes and those implications, there are 2 that we specifically talked about in class. On page 38, he communicates his mom's experience with the rich lady at the market. And on page 63, he communicates his father falling into despair. Stories like these help Alos learn that being poor sets up obstacles that hard work alone cannot overcome. In part 2, that social awakening continues as race is added to the mix. Remember, in part 2, he is now in the United States. And as such, he interacts with people outside of his own race. He realizes almost immediately that his natural affinity towards those who are like him ends up being for naught. This is seen almost right at the beginning as he arrives on page 100. One of his first experiences is getting sold for not being able to pay rent and having a Filipino be the person entrusted to break him and the other Filipinos who are with him. He also realizes that people in the United States live segregated lives. And this becomes an example of the institutional oppression that he's going to be experiencing throughout part 2, part 3, and part 4. Where the reader is first introduced to that on page 121, and then again on page 129. Respectively, this is when being Filipino is considered a crime. So on page 121, you read about a Filipino boy being killed in a pool hall. And on page 129, when the cops ask him if he's Filipino, that results in his beating. So here you see the paradox of the United States. While he came to the US in search for a better life, those that are in theory supposed to protect him end up actually hurting him. He also realizes that this oppression doesn't just come from the whites in power, and the races themselves mostly interact to keep each other down. You see this on page 118 when he describes the establishments we talked about in lecture 2, the gambling establishments, prostitution establishments. Those are mostly run by other minorities. And finally, he also realizes that there are conscious and intentional moves meant to keep the races separated. And you see a very personal example of this on page 173, where he has built a connection with a white girl who's helping him read, and he kind of develops a crush on her. And he then has an experience where he notices an interracial couple, a Filipino and a white girl, being denied service in a cafe, and he becomes very cynical about who he's allowed to love. Additionally, he also begins to describe the crushing of workers' rights. You see this on page 107, where he describes how the big farms, because remember we talked a lot about farm workers in part 2 and in our last lecture, but the big farms understood that unity among the races could crush their efforts to oppress. And so they take conscious and intentional steps towards keeping the minorities that are oppressing separate so that they don't unite forces. We'll learn more about that in part 3. The impact of all this on Alos is seen throughout part 2. At the beginning of part 2, he's still holding on to hope that his decision to come to the US was the right one and would lead to success. This is captured in the quotation shown here, where he says, "I wanted to see other aspects of American life, for surely these destitute and vicious people were merely a small part of it." The diction used here, specifically when he says for surely, and when he says merely a small part, shows that he still holds hope that the negative experiences he's had in the United States are going to be only the minority of experiences that he has. Additionally, you see that hope still alive when he meets his brother Macario on page 130 and 131, and he expresses his desire to buy a house. He gets made fun of for this, and this foreshadows how his hope will ultimately be crushed. And indeed, he slowly starts to lose hope in his character, like those of others about whom he relates anecdotes. Specifically, you see this with his brothers, right? Both Amado and Macario. When he first reunites with Amado, he realizes that Amado has gone into the bootlegging business. And Macario, when he first reunites with him in the United States, is leading a decadent lifestyle. The diction he uses to describe both of his brothers' lives shows that he believes that America's brutality turns people into cynical beasts. In fact, he uses the word brutal, cynical, and beast a lot to describe what he sees happening in the US. With his brothers, he can't believe that his brother Amado turned from being honest and hardworking to making money in a way that Alos deems to be dishonest. Macario's another blow to him because he was the brother for whom everyone worked so hard, and now he's leading this lifestyle that Alos most certainly does not agree with. Alos, however, continues to fight to lead an honest life, but every time he does so, he is met with discrimination. There are various examples of this throughout part two. The first is on page 136 to 137, where he and his brother are paid 50 cents for an hour's worth of work. On page 140 and 141, when he's working as a houseboy with Macario, who does turn and try to lead an honest life himself, he realizes that he's allowed to work so long as he knows his place. On page 156 to 157, again, when the policeman asks him if he's Filipino, that results in a beating. On page 163, when he gets hired working in a restaurant kitchen, he's fired for defending himself against racist comments. It is these personal experiences, as well as what he sees happening to the people around him, that lead Alos to succumb to a dishonest life. You see this first when he starts hanging out with Max on page 165. They unite to rob drunken gamblers, and they even plan on a bank robbery. On page 178, he himself takes control of his dishonest life, and he becomes an expert at gambling, and he begins to cheat people out of their hard-earned cash. Whereas on page 171, where he called what his brother Amado was doing through the bootlegging business cheating people out of their money, he now himself uses diction to show that he believes the gamblers deserve to be cheated, saying even when he cheats a gambler out of the money that was supposed to go to his sick wife, to hell with him on page 178. However, Alos does have our salvation, and the salvation comes through the labor movement, which we'll learn more about in the second part of our lecture. And he learns about the labor movement through his brother Macario. Macario, on page 188 and 189, is quoted by Alos as saying that we must be united in the effort to make an America in which our people can find happiness. He then later says America is a prophecy of a new society of men, of a system that knows no sorrow or strife or suffering. America is a warning to those who would try to falsify the ideals of free men. Here you start seeing that Alos is going to have another awakening. And instead of a social awakening, this time it's an intellectual awakening inspired by Macario's words here. Macario's words show that he believes in the goodness of America, and those who are trying to keep others from leading happy lives in the United States are falsifying the ideals of the free men. And so now that leads Alos towards fighting for this idealistic America that they came to this country to find. And you will see that these thematic topics that came up in part two come up again. The change here is in the message the author is sending about them. So alienation and despair is a thematic topic that you should track throughout part three. And you should think about what can counter alienation and despair. Individual obligations to each other continue to be dealt with in part three, and this time Alos is sending a strong message about why there should be individual obligations to one another. And again, as always, the American dream plays a huge role in this book. And now it's more about what does it mean to access the American dream as opposed to what keeps people from the American dream. That should now set you up to understand what's happening in part 3. You need a little bit of historical context to fully grasp what Burusan is writing. The historical context that we're going to cover is specifically related to the field worker industry. And it's helpful to have an understanding of what this is so that you can follow Alos's fight with the field worker industry and why he has such a strong sense of urgency in fighting for workers' rights, specifically in this field. It is important to note that there's a historic pattern in importing agricultural labor from vulnerable populations here in the United States. You've learned about indentured servants, you learned about slavery. These were both systems used to oppress and exploit vulnerable populations. While indentured servants and slavery no longer exist in the way that you've learned about them in your history classes, there are always populations who meet the description of being vulnerable. So even if one population mobilizes and fights for their rights, there are others to be taken advantage of. And keep this in mind as you read, because the populations are going to be divided by the big farms to ensure that there's always one that can be exploited. Now, it's important to note that the big farms wanted their workers' rights to be limited. If you limit workers' rights, it allows for easier exploitation without there being worry of any sort of ramifications. And the challenges that are specifically faced by the workers are those are long hours, low pay, backworking work with lack of any health care, and exposure to pesticides, which had an impact not only on the workers but also on their children. What you will read about that is organized in order to counter these challenges is the creation of unions. It is important to note that a union is an organized group of workers who work collectively to protect their rights in the workplace. So these rights include wages, hours, safety, healthcare, in short, all the rights that would counter the challenges that they face in the workplace. You will read about 3 different types of opposition to unions in our text. All 3 different types of opposition come at the hands of the big farms who do not want to lose their access to cheap labor. And there are 3 specific types of tactics that they use to keep unionization efforts at a minimum. The first is violence. People were paid to beat up and sometimes kill those who tried to organize a union, or in Alos's case, to write about unionization. There's also laws that were created to keep unions from forming. Those who try to start a union could be thrown in jail, and those who join the union could be fired. And lastly, and you'll read about this right from the beginning of part 3, there's infiltration. Big farms actually sent undercover people in the guise of wanting to help the union workers, but they were there really to provide information about meetings, recruitment efforts, and planned strikes to the big farms so that they could better derail those plans. In part 3, for your third thought paper due next week, the 5 different questions that you answered in part 2 continue to be those that you should be thinking about and annotating towards. Again, you'll be selecting one of these questions on which to write your thought paper, and your mini seminar leaders will be selecting at minimum 2 for you to discuss with the use of protocols on Friday.